Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful and very timely panel on human rights in Russia today. I'm Sarah Phillips. I'm the director of the Robert F. Burns Russian and East European Institute at Indiana University. And this panel is coming to you through the Russian Studies Workshop, which is a research and training hub for Russian studies initiated at Indiana University in 2016, thanks to generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. This is the first panel in a new panel series through the Russian Studies Workshop called Critical Conversations in Russian Studies. I do want to let you know that our panel today is being live tweeted at the Russian Studies Workshop Twitter feed. It's at RSW_IU. Near the end of the panel, our audience members will have the opportunity to put your questions in the Q&A function. So please do that, and then those will be delivered to our panelists. And at this point, I would love to turn things over to Rachel Myers, who is a dual degree student here at Indiana University in the Russian and East European Institute and the Maurer School of Law.
Thank you, Professor Phillips, and thank you to all the panelists for joining us. I'd like to give brief introductions. So we have Dmitry Dubrovsky. He's an associate professor in the School of Politics and Government at the Higher School of Economics. He's an expert on human rights in Russia who focuses primarily on xenophobia, ultra-right nationalism, hate crimes, and hate speech as they relate to freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. Dmitry Makarov is co-chair of the Moscow-Helsinki group. He focuses on issues such as freedom of assembly, right to a fair trial, police impunity, citizen oversight over courts, police, and prisons, as well as human rights education and sustainable support for the human rights movements. Tatyana Margolin is the regional director for Eurasia at the Open Society Foundations, and in this capacity, she works closely with the 7 national foundations in Eurasia and helps initiate and sustain cross-regional partnerships to advance Open Society's mission in the region. She previously led the Eurasia program's work on responding to the reactionary backlash and closing civic space in the Eurasia region. And today, our moderator, Emma Gilligan, is an associate professor of international studies at Indiana University. She's an expert on human rights, and her most recent book, Terror in Chechnya, Russia and the Tragedy of Civilians in War, examines the war crimes committed by Russian soldiers against the civilian population of Chechnya, placing the conflict in Chechnya within the international discourse on humanitarian intervention in the 1990s and the rise of nationalism in Russia. And now, Professor Gilligan, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel. Good morning to all our panelists. It's terrific to have you here. And good morning to all our guests who have joined us today for this session. It's really been terrific to see the response. And again, our thanks to Indiana University and the Carnegie Grant. So the format today is that we are going to spend as much time as possible listening to our panelists. And we're going to go through about 4 or 5 questions for about 40 minutes. And then we're going to open the discussion up for Q&A. As is mentioned, if you put your questions in, then I'll do my very, very best to synchronize the essence of what you've asked and to bring that back to our panelists. So today, what I would like to begin with, and I think that we'll open, if we don't mind, with Dmitry Dubrovsky. And I want to springboard the conversation by beginning to try and understand what has been the role of Western NGOs, Western assistance in the Russian Federation since the 1990s. And what do you think we can do better today in order to work with the Russian human rights movement?
Thank you very much. I think I would love to see this conversation 20 years ago, actually, because this, you know, that's at that time, in the time of 90s, because of the everywhere we're under these feelings of the, well, everything changed. Finally, the authoritarian regime collapsed. And we now, well, will live in the brightest future we ever had. And that is why I believe that is the lack of criticism, lack of the I would say self-evaluation and self reflection about what had been done in the 90s. That was clearly visible in the my favorite and unfortunately almost alone research on the attitudes of the Russian citizens to the human rights, which was published by the Sarah Mendelssohn and Ted Gerber in the late 90s. That was, just imagine. So there was the first almost a part of the Levada Center, the pollster materials. So that's the Mendelssohn and Gerber article was about the attitudes of the Russian citizens in the late 90s. What we could find from this article. So that is the highest level of paternalism and the Russian citizen looking mostly for the social economical rights and almost totally ignoring and neglecting their political rights already till the 98, 99. So that was the beginning of the moving to the transformation of the Soviet society to the Putin's regime. I would say that the society was already converted to be the Putin's regime supporters. And the question is, for me, is the one of the question: what was wrong? What went wrong in the 90s? And the one of the biggest issue was, from my perspective, this is the lack of understanding of how deeply different by origin what we called civil society in the Western countries and what we have as a kind of civil society organization, kind of civil society activity within the late Soviet Union, early Russia. And my understanding is, so this is even in the small details. When it comes to the Western countries, we are always discussing the civil rights activists. When it comes to the late Soviet Union, early Russia, we always have a kind of competition, contest between the civil rights activists and what we called in Russia общественность. So the kind of a representative of the kind of highest level of the different groups within the society. And this is the reason why already in the second half of 90s, the government, which is starting to slowly come back to the civil society, to control civil society, and which was finally leads to how the Putin started to take under control the civil society organizations, how was simply to substitute, to spoil the very big civil society to this representative of общественность, so this people deeply affiliated with the government somehow. And this is the one point. And second point, maybe this is about the lack of understanding of the problem of the grassroots organizations. This is seems to me very important, because in the way the foreign assistance, it was very important. It was very, very valuable. But at the same time, it has supported us to create the kind of generals without army. The problem is we have the number of the high professionals and even the small, survived Soviet descent in the 90s who have been involved in this recreation of the civil society sphere in Russia. But the problem is, I believe, so this is the totally different, the lack of the institution. So we do not have institutional legacy of the civil society. And instead of that, what have been created? We have created the number of the successful human rights organizations, which have been highly professionalized, focused on the particular sphere of the life, and almost never have the visible and robust connections with the society itself. So what we have a kind of additional extension of what we called in Russia democratic reforms, which was very, very, very weak, and the very end collapsed in the late 90s. And the problem I believe that's one of the stories. So we have created the civil society as the small group of the very well-educated, very compassionate people, but it was very restricted within. So that was encapsulated already in the 90s. And that's why it was so easy in the very end it was so easy to close us in this encapsulated ghetto in the very end, and one by one, they destroy this small and weak civil society, because it wasn't civil society, it was civil society organizations without the civil society per se. That is my analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitry. And we will return back to the question about today's challenges, right, of working with Russian human rights movement in a second. But on that question, and perhaps the question about the lack of sufficient connection and links between Russian society and the movement, I wonder, first of all, Tatyana, and then I'll follow with Dmitry, whether you would like to comment on what Dmitry has said, which I think is obviously a really valid and important point.
Yes, thank you. And again, it's a privilege to speak on this panel. Dmitry, what you're saying is really resonating with me. And this is what we found, not just in Russia, but really across the former Soviet space in Eurasia, that what was missing in their approach in the 90s, when the infrastructure was being created and set up, is the West failed to bring with it grassroots organizing and community organizing tactics that have been key to all the movements in the West. And so immediately went to, I think I'm just repeating what you're saying, essentially, that they skipped that important layer of sustainability of civil society. But I think to maybe fill the picture of what you're saying, I think we started seeing more of that in the 2000s. Possibly, I think you are right that it was too late, but I think we started seeing it much more with, for example, HIV/AIDS activism. And I think by default, it needed to go to the people, right? That movement could not have been started without the grassroots, because it's in the core and the definition of the movement. And I think for that reason, we see that movement still being around, obviously embattled, et cetera, but still more sustainable rather than the mainstream human rights movement. And I think, the LGBT issues are obviously, it's a very contested space in Eurasia. But I think, again, because the links between the LGBT movement and global movement have been deeper, there's also been more of an understanding of community organizing and really, speaking to your neighbors before going to become a professional civil society organization. So I think exactly, I agree with you completely that was a missing element, but I also think that perhaps it's not too late to introduce that element in the future, because again, I don't think we're here to speak a eulogy to the human rights movements in Eurasia. I think we're here to really analyze this difficult moment and come up with some proactive solutions and identify these problems. So I think you identify the problem very well, but I still think that there's room to fix it again. Maybe late, but better late than never.
Dmitry, would you like to comment on that as well?
Sure. Well, I actually think that we are in quite a promising moment at the moment, at this very stage. And quite frankly, I believe that in a way we come back to the roots of the human rights movement. And I can relate to that because I come from I represent Moscow Helsinki Group, which is the eldest functioning human rights organization in Russia, established in 1976. And back then there was a dissident movement built. It's quite funny to say because it was basically 12 courageous people that founded Moscow Helsinki Group and then Helsinki groups throughout other states, including, by the way, the US. So funnily enough, it was from the dissidents from the Soviet Union that started institutions building up in different states, including in the West. So kind of the notion of human rights being reinvented in the Soviet Union and brought to the West, not the other way around. Then, of course, there's a logic of Cold War that jumped in a whole different relation of the Soviet Union and the West. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and I agree with Dmitry's analysis there. There was an influx of professional NGOs coming in, focused on expert work, focused on professional careers. I myself joined already at the end of that dynamic. It was still kind of cool to be a human rights defender. You can still make a career in the human rights movement, but starting from 2000 with exactly kind of the second Chechen war and with Putin coming into power, it already becoming too dangerous too risky, not very well looked on. So there were, on one hand, stories of the glorious past, and there were many professionals working in the field. On the other hand, it was already, the picture started to look more and more gloomy. And in a way, right now, we are faced with the challenge of redefining what human rights movement is. What is a human rights defender in the current state of affairs in Russia? And I think we'll have some time to cover that more later on. But to come back a bit to that relations with the West, the relations with the West in the beginning were kind of like in the Cold War dynamic. We were looking as dissidents towards the West as something that will liberate eventually, which is a symbol of freedom, symbol of liberation. In the 90s, that kind of carried on, and there was a lot of illusions around that are not, and now we can actually state the end of those illusions. And in a way, we are redefining not only the human rights movement in Russia, we are redefining what human rights movement is globally, because there are no longer, I dare to say that, states that you can rely on as constant allies in the struggle of human rights in the diplomatic arena, in the international arena, so on. So in a way, the movement has to kind of re-engage its relationship with people in power, whether they state that they are for human rights, whether they state they are against human rights, or whether they say one thing and do other things. So that's the challenge that we're facing at the moment, from what I can see.
Thank you very much. I'd like to develop that a little bit more, some of the points that were brought up by all of you. And probably, Dmitry, I'll go back to you. Tatyana had mentioned that she felt that by the 2000 there were some opportunities, right, or windows of potential engagements or ways to fill that gap, right, between society and the human rights movement. So I'm wondering, in the same order, Dmitry, whether you could talk to that question a little bit, and also then comment on how you think that US and European human rights activists, or those, you know, who support the human rights movement in Russia, can better help, you know, create those links in a more sustainable way.
Well, because we have the kind of, well, number of the positive, I would say less positive experience. Let's recall me the situation with the ombudsman story. Let me remind you that 20 years ago, everybody were encouraged to have the ombudsman, and that was the story when the ombudsman institution had been installed first in Moscow in 90s, and then lately it started to disseminate it now. Till the late 90s, they have already almost 30 or 35, I don't remember the exact number, the representatives who are, well, responsible for human rights. But at that time, it was, the first ombudsman was Sergei Adamovich Kovalyov. And now, what we have right now, this institution totally spoiled. That's what we have right now. When the human rights ombudsman in St. Petersburg seriously described the violation of the rights of protesters on the street, it sounds absolutely unusual for the normal narrative which had been reproduced by these officers of the ombudsman, like another ombudsman of Moscow visited this detention center in the Sakharova, which were this currently in the news, because this was the center where they had been overcrowded by the people had been detained during the last protest campaign. She couldn't find anybody who complained. So this is about the very interesting story, because our European partners, including American partners, always believe that to install the institution is enough. Well, I mean, install something which looks like the democratic institution. It's enough to hope for the normal development of this institution for the future. But the biggest issue is the authoritarian regime of the Putin already in 2000 started to think how they should emulate and mimicking these democratic institutions after the story when the Putin's regime failed to take under control civil society, they probably would love to. And they immediately turned to another policy to punish the independent NGO and to create the Gongo, create the quasi NGO, and they organized even networks of the quasi human rights institutions. This is the way of most authoritarian countries in the post-Soviet space. This is very well known. But what is interesting, and that was the point when the authoritarian regime started to, because the Dmitry referred to the notion of human rights. Here is the authoritarian regime started to elaborate the alternative version of human rights. Here was the undermine not only the credibility of the human rights organization, portraying them as a kind of, the foreign agent. It was on the late stage, but still not very, loyal to the Russian state. Well, who are allegedly working rather for the foreign interests than the interest of the Russian state, but also to create alternative realm of the human rights, alternative NGO, alternative concept of human rights, which was lately proposed by the for example, Russian Orthodox Church. And the variant, I believe that was the battle we weren't ready to. So because the problem was officially, internationally, Russia still were on the same plate with the European Court of Human Rights, with the international organizations. And that was the kind of discussion about, it looks like we still have the same language of human rights. But the problem is at that time already, the regime started to spoil, to disrupt the general attitudes, the general construction of the human rights argument. And that was both in the education and science, and especially in political narrative within the country. And that was the story when at the very end, it exploded. Because what we have right now in the implemented into the anti-NGO, anti-human rights legislation, it was born in the 2000s within this narrative, within these discussions about the human rights from the conservative perspective.
Thank you, Dmitry. Tatyana, I'm wondering whether you could comment on my initial question about some of these openings and narrowing some of these gaps.
I was going to react to Dmitry by saying that, imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So yes, I definitely agree with you that we saw this alternative infrastructure that was using our language, co-opting our concepts, and also creating alternative funding streams, frankly, right? Because then that's when we saw the system of presidential grants being awarded to the Gongos, et cetera. But to go back to your initial question, Emma, in terms of what moments of solidarity and openings of solidarity there are between US civil society, for example, in general, Western civil society and Russian civil society, I think there are many. And again, I think we are not to redo the mistakes that we made in the late 90s, where we sort of colonized the human rights space by introducing these concepts from top down. I think there is a lot of room to build solidarity. For example, elevating Russian voices in this particular moment in American publications is a key opportunity for US media, independent media, mainstream media, corporate media. We continue to see more traction and leverage given to Western journalists covering Russian issues than we do to incredibly broad, deep, and very sophisticated field of Russian independent journalism that I think we can all agree exists in spite of everything. And so, for example, last year we saw the New York Times win a Pulitzer Prize for reporting that was originally done by a small outfit in Russia called Project, without as much as a hyperlink to the original research. So one thing Western media can do is A, elevate the voices, and B, give credit where credit is due. Because it's one thing for the New York Times to travel someplace to do investigations with full support of a Western name, insurance, and resources. And it's very different when these brave journalists take on these assignments, literally risking their lives. So that's one. I think there is a ton of solidarity that can and has been built between civil society groups. For example, the ACLU in the US has been already working with ACLUs of the world. So there is a partner that they've worked with in Russia as well, essentially exchanging tactics, both from fundraising to how to push back against authoritarianism. But I think one thing that we also cannot let go of, and I think it was touched on by Dmitry earlier, is that some of the negative trends in Eurasia actually originate in the United States. So for example, over the last two decades, we've seen a concerted effort by the US far right to expand its rhetoric and its tactics into Eurasia of the traditional values, for example, which then became started being fluently used by the Russian government in the Skrepy narrative. And that's, we've seen that in the US for decades. We see images in anti-abortion protests in Russia that are literally printed PDF materials sent from US far right to Russian counterparts. So we see that there is a lot of learning that could be done between Americans that have been fighting the far right for decades and Russians who are, facing some of these tactics for the first time most recently. And then finally, I think one thing we cannot ignore is this superiority that Americans have exhibited over the last 4 years, when they have experienced utterly unprepared all the authoritarian tactics from the Trump administration. And there were so many lessons that could have been learned of resistance and resilience from Russian civil society and Eurasian civil society. But somehow this, American exceptionism was always saying, oh no, this, it's very different. We're different. Our institutions will protect us. And we saw on January 6th what 4 years of ignorance can lead to here in the United States. So I think solidarity and learnings, they go both ways. And there's a ton that people on the ground here can learn from the resilience and creativity of Russian civil society.
Yeah, I would like to, to back that up quite strongly, because that is the story of many conversations that I had with grassroots activists throughout Europe or throughout the US. Because I may represent a human rights institution at this moment, but my background is actually in grassroots activism and in community organizing. So when I talk about our police oversight tactics, to activists who work with migrant rights in Vienna, they say that's something that we need because police is just as brutal there as on the streets of Moscow. And then I talk to environmental activists in the US, they say, yes, some of the crackdown that we are facing is very similar to what you've been telling us about. So there is a lot of room for exchange of tactics. And there is very little room for this kind of superior approach that we in the West are the experts who know how things should be done. And we've seen a lot of that in the past. And I've had my fair share of very heated exchange with some of the US experts, hopefully none of them are represented here, about their recipes for how human rights work should be done in Russia. So in that sense, there was a dangerous illusion at the moment, in the 90s especially, that human rights have won. They have not. They have not won in Russia, they have not won elsewhere, and it's because it's a constant struggle. And in a way, the dissident movement in Russia also has been a victim of its own success, because we may have Sergei Adamovich Kovalyev as our ombudsman, and we may have human rights defenders in the parliament, but we had almost no critical voices left outside of that to challenge the government. So that has been the very challenging kind of roots in many Eurasian countries, many post-Soviet countries. Then the elite change, and you have a civil society basically joining the power, who is there to perform the watchdog function, who's there to continue to criticize. I had actually Gary Kasparov, who's one of the voices for human rights now in the US, yelling at me and my fellow activists, and we dare to say that we'll be just as critical towards him and his fellow kind of opposition activists when they come into power as we are at the moment towards Putin, because that was a notion not very kind of, we supposed to be a united front. That's something that Kasparov has created to challenge the regime, right? So in that sense, once more, there is a trap of falling into those kind of complacency to power, and also a challenge of falling into the trap of kind of regime change logic. Then human rights is something that is to help us fight the dictatorship and to change it for democratic leaders. I believe it may be a tool, but it's not its main purpose. Its main purpose is to defend the basic rights and basic freedoms. So in a way, because of that kind of politicization, I may say, human rights has also fell victim to many speculation and many misinterpretation. And we may well witness that now on the streets of Moscow, on the streets of other Russian cities. Once more, there is a genuine quest for justice. It's a genuine quest to end police brutality, to end the беспредел, произвол in the courts, when people in 5 minutes are given sentences and sent to Sakharov, ironically, to the detention center for migrants who've been facing those very practices for many years. And those very migrants that Navalny has for many times blamed in his rhetoric that is sometimes xenophobic. I mean, he's a courageous man, and I would not dare to criticize him in a position at which he is now, but he's not about human rights. But people on the streets, many of them, intuitively understand that rhetoric not much differently than kind of people in the West. So in that sense, we are in a very interesting time when we have all those challenges coming at us in a time of conflict. And once more, kind of bringing us back to a question what human rights movement should be in this interconnected global world where far right brings international solidarity and human rights movement is still very much construed from top down.
Okay, thanks, Dmitry. There are a lot of points there that I'd like to go back to, and one of them, Dmitry, I think we'll go back to later when you said you wanted to comment on sort of redefining what the human rights movement is. One thing, though, I think that perhaps our audience would like to hear more about is something that I think that those of us who follow what's going on in Russia, and specifically, obviously, with Navalny and the increasing number of political prisoners, right, is generally the anti-Western sentiment in the press, right, or amongst Russian society. And I'm wondering, because I also have Russian friends here who say, as Tatyana said, right, that essentially we're not necessarily getting the voices of the really good Russian journalists translated into English, then conveyed back to the West, right? But on a deeper level, what do you think can be done to address this kind of large-scale, widespread anti-Western sentiment? Dmitry Dubrovsky, would you like to comment on that?
Well, first of all, here is the deepest anti-Western sentiment has always been among Russian elite. So that's the 90s. It was also very well visible, but the story was at that time Russian elite very much need to international support, international investment, and international loan to survive in reality. So the Russia was very much dependent on the international monetary fund, for example, and so on and so forth. But what I'm thinking right now about to what should be done, first of all, first of all, not to simplify the story. The story is not so simple, it's so white black. Of course, Navalny is not the hero of like Sakharov or like Nelson Mandela. But we are also, those who are following Navalny, we are also very much diverse. So that is from the nationalists to the liberals, from the monarchists, by the way, to the communists. So here is the very interesting story. And my hope is the best would be to tell the story of how difficult it is to get the national or civil society consensus. So I believe the American experience, when it's the civil rights revolution and they're moving for the LGBT movement, well, for me, it was shock to understand how long was the way of the mutual understanding between the gay and lesbian movement. So that is the stories which is absolutely unknown in Russia. And it looks like from here. So that civil society will always be very, very, very stable, very robust, and very influential in the Western countries, which is pretty new from my perspective situation. Well, 20, 30 years, no more. And this is why, from my perspective, these ways should go the stories about the practices, maybe the real people who were involved in such kind of consensus creation, how it could be done, because that is what we really need for the nearest future. This is the one story. And other way is the complexity. Journalism is always trying to simplify the story. So this is unfortunately that's normal course of the journalism, because the journalist should deliver the simple story to the audience, and to cut off all the non-important details. But keeping in mind your question, what could be done? I met here this in the internet, in the very interesting project from Germany right now, when the people trying to translate the both way to very important and very actual publication, disregard whoever it was, from the German to Russian, from Russian to German. That might be the best way to get the immediate response and the more adequate and more direct voice, let's put it this way. So from my perspective, so to understand the complexity, we don't need to give the voice for the journalist, give the voice to the activists, give the voice to the people who are in. They might be, sometimes not very polite, or they might be not very clearly define their theories, but this is the clear voice. And these voices should be visible, especially keeping in mind the very serious and almost total censorship in Russia, to give the direct voice for the criticism. This is more or less what have been done in the Soviet dissent, when the Soviet dissent translated and transmitted and sending their observations and directly to the West, and then the Radio Liberty started to read it online, like it's today online. So from my perspective, so what is the real, what we're really missing? We always have a kind of special filter of delivering these needs and claims. This is might be very friendly filter, like us, like human rights activists, or the research scholars, or the journalists. But in the very end, we have the very filtrated and very clear from all the possible important details of the content message. What we really need to improve and to get these people signed, they are the members of the global community. Their voices should be heard directly. But here is the general and natural obstacles, because we do have, this is I have in my notes, language. And this is another course, because when it comes to the Dmitry is speaking perfectly in English. So, but the problem is that the 99% of Russian activists are not. So they couldn't. And even the young, they might be different, but it certainly depends on those who are living and studying in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they're fine. But when it comes to the Siberia, when it comes to the small cities of Russia, which is the huge, and the number of people who might be the members, might be join this community, might be also the right these voices, they couldn't, because this is there's natural obstacles in the language perspective. And this is another, I do not have recipe actually, but I think there's the important thing to make these voices of the grassroots people visible and hearable.
Thank you, Dmitry. Tatyana, would you like to comment on that as well, please?
Sure. I think I will make, your original question about what we can do about anti-Western sentiment among Russia and Russian elites. I think, again, I will echo what Dmitry is saying. A lot of this is really about framing and about rhetoric. I think the issue is much larger than Russian anti-Western sentiment. I think the liberal world order and the eminence of human rights have been questioned by authoritarians throughout the world, including places like Hungary, like Poland, like the United States. The exact same issues for which protesters are being vilified in Russia are the issues that were on the front pages of American newspapers over the summer around the racial justice protests that were taking place here, where the authoritarian right in the United States affiliated and sort of went through great depth and length to portray as liberal, infused, installed values rather than human rights and universal values. So I think, again, this is taken directly from the authoritarian toolkit that was pioneered maybe by Russia, certainly, but it's not limited. And we've seen Brazil use these similar tactics. And I think there are many, the moment is unique because we've also seen a huge correlation between handling the pandemic and authoritarian states. You remember that the top 4 countries with the greatest number of deaths during COVID have been these authoritarian countries, the United States, of course, being one of them at the time because it was living under Trump. So I think, again, it's portrayed as anti-Western rhetoric in Russia, but we can't let it. We cannot let the language of human rights and in general, the concept of human rights be portrayed as a Western value. It is not a Western value. Human rights are not Western, they're universal. We have a universal declaration of human rights signed by many actors that are outside of the Western liberal order. But I do think that we're going to be seeing much, much more of this from Russia. You saw Russian colleagues, Maria Zakharova, who for some unknown to me reason was given a platform on Dosh for over an hour to spew her theories about, the West is just a tiny part of the world and really Russia is partners globally, really essentially giving us her theory of change, right? Telling us that Russian future is not resting with the West, it's resting with other places. We've seen, of course, Russia expand its authoritarian toolkit into Africa. We've seen it go east as well. And today, a couple of hours ago, we saw Joseph Borrell, highest ranking EU official visiting Russia for the last couple of years, be ridiculed and humiliated in public. Again, this happened within the last 3 hours. So again, I think the issue is much less between sort of Western assessment of Western elites or Western values by the elites, but really we cannot let the Russian government steal this narrative and craft it. And I'm sure that Dmitry Makarov, his organization is working hard on emphasizing that these values are universal, they're not Western, and they're rooted here as much as they're rooted elsewhere.
And I agree that, yeah, there's a lot of mythology around this anti-Western sentiment, but then you look at the amount of attention that is given to the West and to the rest of the world. I mean, in Russian general public, or even in discussions in the policy circles, I mean, it's uncomparable. Nobody discusses the political processes in China or even in Kazakhstan. It's the US that is at the center of the attention, or the West, which is also a very strange notion, which combines countries that are very different from each other. Is Hungary now anti-West? Is Poland anti-West? Is the Trumpist supporters in the US anti-West? What is anti-West? We kind of don't really know. So because we are still kind of in the intellectual legacy of the Cold War, surprisingly enough, kind of post-war world. We still don't have a name for the post-Soviet space, a proper name to name the cultural space, which is somewhat similar and in many aspects very different. So we are still in this Cold War sentiment, in the colonial kind of mindset, and there is Russia and there is the post-Soviet states and so on. So there's a lot of kind of intellectual discussions to be had there. But what I wanted to say is not only about that. I wanted to say that there are also a lot of the things linking, missing in a direct dialogue and direct connection between the Russian civil society and the civil society in other countries, including the US or including Western Europe. I mean, Dmitry has said about the importance of giving voice to the activists, not just to talking heads, politicians, or kind of even journalists, or even established human rights defenders, but to kind of a more broader public. I mean, of course, I'm not saying that it's easy to do, but there were a lot of discussions about the US-Russian civil society dialogue at the beginning of Obama administration. And what did it come down to? To Mark-Folster-Surkov Commission. Once more top-down approach. While in the beginning, and I mean, our organization and myself, I was involved in discussing how it could be structured. And we had many suggestions that it could be direct links between the universities. It could be dialogues between professional groups, teachers of history, because there's a lot of US-Russian common history. Land lease, World War II, and before that, Alaska. I mean, many things that you can look into with a lot of interest to explore the Russian settlements in America. I mean, history teachers, doctors, lawyers. I mean, professional groups coming together to discuss those things. Direct civil society dialogue, not only about the things of the past, but also how do we see each other in the global world. I mean, once more, is there a common vision for Russian and US civil society, or broader kind of what Western, because Russia is also Western, right? Western civil society. What is our vision for the global world? Or are we limited to the vision that our governments impose on us? What is our position towards how the UN should be? What is our position towards what OEC should be? What I may remind you unites together kind of entire, basically, Northern Hemisphere in the common organization, which at its core, as the Helsinki Accords and the Helsinki movement reminds us, is actually not only about security cooperation, not only about economic cooperation, but also about cooperation on issues like human rights, rule of law, pluralistic democracy, all the things that have been threatened by the governments all throughout the Northern Hemisphere. So it should be the civil society response to that, that we have a lot of room to discuss with many actors. So I think, and that's a type of dialogue that I would like much more like to see than a dialogue between Lavrov and Pompeo, or whoever is now at the head of Department of State, right? So, and that's once more decolonizing human rights rhetoric, and also kind of bringing it down to the civil society where it belongs.
So I'm hearing two threads here. One is the call for more transnational solidarity, and also for more upstream, right, movements across the world that aren't all top down. I think I'm going to be urged in a minute to give the floor to our many guests. But before we close this section, I'd like to go back to Dmitry Makarov's point about redefining the human rights movement. And Dmitry, I'd like to give you a little bit of time to speak to that before I open to the floor. And obviously, Tatyana and Dmitry, you might like to respond to what Dmitry's saying. So go ahead.
Well, I think this is the interesting. At the time, the research, especially in 2000, they shows us the interesting story. We do have this serious disappointment in the ideas of human rights, but at the same time, it was the serious request in the society to the ideas of justice and equality, and that is how the unexpected source might became, I would say, at that time. And that is the movements for the whole ecological movements, for the ecological, for the ecology, for the for the
environmental movements. Yeah.
Yeah, environmental movements. Yes. Yeah, for the of course for those who are fighting against the fraud in the building construction, and the people invested into the common construction, and they've been they people literally steal their money, and the government did nothing, and the people protested, and within these groups. And finally, of course, citizens, the angry citizens who were there always been, and they started be the core of the protest at 2011 to 12. All these groups, they are sociologically unrecognizable in the way this was very difficult to find their relationship and their attitudes to the human rights. But what is the precisely interesting right now, and I'm not quite sure about what Dima said about the Navalny the audience attitudes to human rights. I'm sure when we would address to them, and this is my hope to make a research about them, about their attitude to human rights, then general criticism would be the general attitudes, but at the same time, request to the justice, the fighting against corruption, the full disillusionment about about what the political power, what is the Putin, what is the countries right now going. And I would say this is the basically what we should be careful how we could translate, or how we could very carefully take these demands and translate them into the language, or pack them, or find a way to explain the relationship between these demands and human rights. Because currently we still didn't do that. We still didn't get it. What we still exist in the way of the political struggle with the state for the human rights. At the time when there comes, and slowly the human rights community who are assisting and who are providing the help and who are starting to explain that what is the real relationship between these claims of to the justice and the equality and the human rights. We're still on this way, but this is the absolutely new field of our work. So this is already to try to very carefully to grow, to assist these feelings and to assist this notion of human rights growing from this soil.
Thank you, Dmitry. Tatyana, and then I'll finish, Dmitry Makarov, with you. Tatyana, would you like to comment on that?
I think I want to say something slightly different that I wish that we had more time to discuss, of course, is the importance of the cross-border solidarity in the Eurasia region, in the post-Soviet space, right? We've seen very clearly the Belarusian protests speak directly to the Russian protests. We have seen the two movements there really borrow from each other's tactics. And I think that's an incredibly exciting and organic development. As much as, of course, it's being portrayed by the propaganda as something that was imposed by the West, this was an incredibly organic effort, right? We've seen localization of this protest, right? The protests going into neighborhoods rather than these big marches that everyone seems to, kind of has gotten used to associating with protests. So I think, again, and this really, I mean, in a way that adds and enhances Dmitry's point that it's true, the rhetoric does have to be rewritten. It's not that the war has been lost. It's really, we are now in the battle for, we're really in a spin battle in a lot of ways, right? And this is all connected with the disinformation war and the disinformation campaigns that are obviously coming again in the authoritarian toolkit. It's prepackaged coming from the region to the rest of the world. And what we've seen is that the best way to fight these things is not by fighting disinformation, right? It's to propose an alternative, appealing framework for the general public that wants justice, that wants to be able to walk outside to pick up a cup of coffee and not get arrested because there is a mass roundup of people happening in their neighborhood. I think that's quite universal and a fairly easy sell to the general public. But I want to, of course, see the floor to Dmitry to speak more about this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it relates to a question that we got in Q&A about what the current moment in Russian protest means for human rights and for civil society in a broader sense. I remember back in 2012, there was a similar kind of popular protests against another Putin's elections, right? And there was, I remember speaking on Occupy Abai, which is actually a copy protest from Occupy Wall Street, speaking to the international solidarity. And I talked to people about the issues that we've been working on. Police brutality, justice in the court system, and we were discussing what can we do as a society, and it was a vibrant discussion. And actually, a lot of our police oversight tactics, the model of observers, which is a independent third party at the rallies, was born out of those discussions, out of that previous popular uprising, in a way, right? But a lot of that momentum was lost. A lot of that momentum was repressed, although that was also a moment of solidarity, a moment of kind of a lot of people looking for many other ways of civic engagement than just protesting in the street. Now, that moment was lost in repression and in depression. And a lot of our fellow activists fled for criminal persecution to other countries. A lot of them became apathetic and fled internally to their jobs, to their families, and so on. Now, it seems there's a new wave. And the new wave that is facing similar challenges. But this wave is much more different. I mean, it's much wider. It's much more enrooted. Many of my apolitical friends are coming to me now saying, what can we do? People in the streets of Voronezh, where I live most of the time, actually, talk about it. They ask, what can we do? Not only to help those detained, but also can we do to change the system? So they may not all of them sympathize Navalny, but for them, he also is becoming a voice of a mobilization point and a voice of truth and a voice of courage. but a lot of them are also about, okay, we cannot put up any more with the injustices, the corruption. We have to do something. We have to become agents. And Navalny, in an amazing move, kind of building a political movement, which was centered around his figure, kind of left it decapitated in a way, and said, not only myself am an agent of change, you all are agents of change. So it is a kind of a challenging spot for everyone. And I had a funny discussions of some of the grassroots groups in Voronezh that wanted to help those people who were detained. It was about 250 people in the city of 1 million. Before that, we never had detentions more than 10 or dozen people, right? So it's kind of enormous number of people. It's a political party in its own sense. You can build them among those who were detained. So anyhow, so there's a grassroots initiatives to help those people. And they were asking, why are there no human rights organizations in Voronezh? Can they help? I mean, well, and they are in ruins because of the legislation, because of internal struggles, because of all the kind of many problems, right? But there's still an expectation that there are some groups that may help to come to your rescue, whether it's over the info, apology of protest, apologia protesta, some lawyers, human rights defenders. There's still kind of an illusion that they will come to help. And in many cases they do. In many cases, they're not able to. They're not able to encompass that massive amount of repression. So whether people are ready or not, they are claiming the agency. They have to organize, similar to what Belarusians, which are in much worse conditions, have been in much worse conditions for many years, found that space for agency, that space for community organizing, that space for self-organization. They had to learn it fast. And the Russian civil society is learning it fast too. So in a way, it is a turning point. And I see a lot more optimism now than I've seen back in 2012. I don't know where it will lead us because the state is still powerful. The repressive mechanisms are still there, but the fear, once more, coming back to Navalny's message, the fear is gone. And that allows me to be persistent in my optimism, as I was back in 2012, and I remain now.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Dmitry. I want to open it up to the floor now because I've already gone over time. And I think, so anybody who would like to ask a question, please put it into the Q&A. I see that marginally, Dmitry, you already answered one of the first questions. You got to the chat button before me, and so I don't think that we need to comment on that one again. So, are there any questions? Would any Rachel or Sarah, would you like to offer a question to begin with, and then we can wait for people to launch questions in the Q&A section? I can't see anyone there. Ah, Sarah, there you go.
Sorry, I was muted. Well, first, I just want to say, wow, what a fantastic conversation. Thank you all. It's been really very informative, and I know that our audience has enjoyed. I actually see a question coming through now, Emma, if you'd like to take that one from Maria Wisniewski.
Yeah, let me begin with this. Maria Wisniewski writes that she finds it interesting that there is a lot of discussion regarding grassroots movements and activism, which seems to align with an increasing focus on local politics. I know that in the US, there's been a lot of emphasis on getting involved in local and state politics to make sustainable and impactful change. Does this seem like a space for change that can move upstream, or is it too likely to be co-opted by higher level politics? Dmitry Dubrovsky, would you like to begin?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's precisely very very general, a very global process right now. So that's the people starting to accommodate their neighborhoods in all the sense of this word, in political, in cultural, in social. The people starting more living not within their personal apartments, but they started to consider their private space, more broad, space around the buildings, and sometimes around the districts itself. So what we are having right now in general, so this is the kind of movement for the citizens' rights, the right for the city. And the problem, I think, for Russia is that one of the issues of this, the Russia is partly so what we are calling in the political science the participatory authoritarianism. So that's what the Russia also tried to spoil. These grassroots organizations, they try to be rerouted in the way or redirected to the less sensitive or the absolutely not challenging sphere for the government. For example, in St. Petersburg, that is like the story, for example, when the St. Petersburg citizen in the last election were invited to vote for the redistribution with 0.1% of the general city budget, but this it was defined as a serious participation of citizens in the city administration in decision-making process. So what is the especially careful, and what I would say, I would be here very special careful to combine this tendency. I mean, this kind of this is the very famous and fashion even term, globalization of the local politics. But this globalization of the local politics, unfortunately, met already the authoritarian tendency to spoil these activity as well. So they try to first of all to isolate this group into the state control activity, and do not convert this activity into the independent civil society organization, grassroots organization. So that is, well, although I could see a lot of the potential benefit for the civil society development, but here is the one of the very much in the predictable and visible threat.
Thank you, Dmitry. Tatyana, I'm wondering if you could comment on your experience in relation to that question.
With regard to the local growing into something bigger, I think, again, to me, that's where I think, Dmitry, you're completely right. There are definitely dangers. And in fact, just today, I read that some Belarusian neighborhood chats, turned into where is the biggest sale on diapers, like sort of became very mundane and apolitical. So in a way, you can argue that the protest has been annihilated and depoliticized and killed. But I think in other ways, we see that it's the most sustainable way to protest and to really organize is when things start from the local. Obviously, we've seen this a lot from the environmental movement. And again, I'm speaking more broadly than just Russia. I'm speaking about Central Asia as well, where we work, where people started very locally, measuring pollution levels in their neighborhood and then bringing it to the attention of their local city hall. In that way, becoming connected to a more broader regional environmental movement, which then brings them in contact with other people globally. So I think there still is a lot of potential. Certainly, I think, and again, this speaks to the first question that was asked. This is, obviously a lot of my Russian colleagues obviously have heard, there's a lot of, did we wake up in a different country today? Is this the biggest breaking moment from yesterday that these, people came out, and did Navalny change everything? I think, again, my organization has been involved in the region for over 30 years. We're much more cautious to make these broad sweeping statements. I don't think one particular event, changes the course and the shape of a country's future. But I do think this is a very dangerous moment because we see that the state is willing to stop at nothing, right? The state very clearly drew the lines that they're willing to cross. And at this point, it's guns blazing, and they're not gonna, they have made a statement to civil society, to activists, that this is what will happen to you if you come out. But I think what Dmitry Makarov said earlier that gives so much hope is that when people are so blazingly faced with injustice, they do stop being afraid. Right? Because if you can get detained just for going out and to buy some bread, you might as well go out for a cause if you have the same equal chance of being detained anyway. So I think, again, I do think there's a lot of hope in the local. It's much more sustainable. Also, you can get a lot more done, frankly, when you're trying to, work on your local level. We've seen, obviously, the Moscow City Duma candidates accomplishing quite important things. So I think local politics in general has much quicker reward. But again, will it change things globally? It's to be seen. I think some will definitely influence the process and others will just stay local. And I think that's fine too. I think it's about us also creating realistic expectations for what kind of change we want to see.
Okay, I see that people have overcome their shyness and now we've got quite a few questions. So Dmitry, I'm wondering if you could deal with the next one from Kyle Thompson. And Kyle asks, a good question actually, all are good, but this is, I think, especially pertinent. He asks that with regard to the Russian foreign agents law, do donations sent from outside of Russia to civil society organizations such as LGBTQ rights organizations possibly do harm to those organizations?
Well, they entail risks. First of all, they entail risks of carrying a foreign agent label. And that's a risk associated with any foreign money, whether it comes from the US or from Belarus, it doesn't matter. So the legislation, and whether it's connected to any type of activity that could be labeled as political or to just any critical or not even critical activity towards the government, it still can put you into the foreign agents list and make your organization subject to various inspections. So of course there are risks entailed. At the same time, I don't think it should discourage the Western movements or Western activists or Western supporters to find ways to connect those grassroots activists, the movements in Russia, and find ways to support them. I think there are things that you could do still, and the donations directly to accounts in Russia, of course, are problematic, as they are in many other restrictive environments. I mean, it would be actually, would be quite a great brainstorming session to gather activists that are interested to help Russian civil society, activists in a broader sense, right? People in an active position to discuss what ways could be done. Because sometimes, I'm quite inspired with our cooperation, for example, with Indiana University students and graduates who helped us to do legal research, using their capacity as professionals to help us in our work in Russia. That's a small cooperation, but it's still a model for cooperation. You can find many other ways of how you can help, not just going down to making donations. And I think Russian civil society also needs to learn to offer people, regardless whether they are in Russia or in the West, ways to help outside of just donating. That's kind of level up.
Tatyana, maybe you could also speak to that question if you would.
Sure. Of course, Dmitry is right. He works for, Russian NGO that is dealing with foreign agent things and such. But I also will say that most of the groups, if you're really wanting to donate to someone, they will say it on their website, whether or not, they will face any penalties. Some groups, of course, have set up alternative mechanisms abroad where they can do crowdfunding. But again, it really just depends. And again, I don't think any group will create a donate button and put itself at risk. It will warn you. So if you really want to donate to someone, just go to their website and you will know whether or not they're accepting donations from abroad.
I have a couple of questions here. One that I'm going to try and reframe. I'm not sure of exactly what the participant is wanting to ask, except that she asks, do you recognize or realize that there are internal reasons for such a bad situation with human rights in our country? She is obviously, I think, a teacher who works in the education field, and says that, you know, that there are a lot of researchers who are working on positive issues around, you know, corruption and so forth.
If I may probably respond briefly. So this is, I'm afraid this is a rather personal story of the author and author battle. But in general, here is for the first part of this question, it's important. In fact, what we do have, because of the situation when most of the NGOs should work in the, well, I'm not speaking about legal frame, but sometimes they should find an alternative way to survive, let's put it this way. And that created the unhealthy atmosphere in the number NGO. So what we do have, I would agree, so we do have internal tension, not only the external. Internal tension because of the lack of the ethic of conduct. Internal issues because the lack of the, let's say, the transparency. Well, we cannot be transparent because this is, well, if we will publish well, we couldn't survive, or we should be fully evacuated from the country. So that's the real fact. So, and here's the problem, because we cannot fully follow the legal requirements of this state, because if we would, we will fully unveil the like LGBT organizations, for example. They, for example, should be unveiled all the members of the community because of this stupid and absolutely, you know, humiliating legislation. I mean, about the foreign agent. Not about propaganda law, so this is another story. But they should publish for example, they should inform about all the members of this community, which is the precisely private information, and this very sensitive, keeping in mind the level of homophobia in Russia. But that's these, you know, demands, which are, from my perspective, unlawful in its core. They're creating the unhealthy situation within their country. And what we should have right now, we should have a special public investigation. I'm involved about the alleged issues with the international youth human rights movement. I think Dmitry Makarov would comment it, but I cannot comment the details. But I would say that this is one of their legacy of the 90s, when the substantial amount of human rights organizations were precisely one person leaded organization, and everything was fully, and sometimes still fully, depends on these personal characteristics and his or her personal level of morality, attitudes to the other people, and so on and so forth. So, and because of in these unhealthy circumstances, we do not have the normal, for example, basically in the most of the NGO, we do not have the normal system of the replacement of the leaders, of the changing of the directors, of the advisory boards, and so forth, which is quite normal for the foreign NGO. So this is I would say my recommendations right now for the foreign NGO, despite of the difficulties. What we should, I would say, what it was the foreign donors should demand, to have the foreign NGO, for all the Russian NGO, certain level of transparency in their work, and the decision-making process and management, and the interior rules, but also certain ethic conduct. Because I would say this is one of the serious challenge right now for the human rights NGO. I am not speaking about this particular story, but I'm afraid to review the human rights movement, we should seriously reconsider all the principles of the NGO construction and operation.
Dmitry Makarov, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I'd back that up. I mean, when you live in an authoritarian regime for many ways, and you're in a logic of constant struggle, in a logic of kind of being in an occupied palace where you fight off kind of the enemies outside, I mean, you copy some of those authoritarian practices. And also the fact that you name person, a man or woman, a human rights defender, does not make that person perfect. When you have a democracy leader, that does not make him democratic in his conduct. And we have many examples of that, given, for example, Myanmar, right, at the moment, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, right? So, I mean, we have to, at some point, shift away from this, triangle of victim, oppressor, and the good savior, right? Because it's not a healthy thing to have. So I have a lot of optimism towards the kind of the new movements that arise, towards some of the internal processes that take place in the human rights movement as well. A lot of reconsideration of some of the practices that have to stay in the past, and also incorporating voices that have not been heard before, voices of feminists, voices of environmental activists, voices of those who start to reflect about some of the new colonial practices, relations not only between the West and Russia, but also between Moscow and regions, and so on. So there's a lot of, it's an interesting time. And it's we're going to see a lot of those internal discussions in the future. I think that codes of conduct or some sort of regulations help, but I don't think that they're universal. But will help is an honest and open discussion about those problems. Of course, it is problematic to have an authoritarian state, because you cannot have it in the open, you cannot have it in the public, because you victimize, you risk your members, as an example with LGBT organization goes, you risk repression from the state, you risk the general attack on people who have nothing to do with bad practices, but will be associated with it because the state wants it to be associated. So there's a lot of challenges for an open public discussion about those issues. But I do think that at least open internal discussion should take place around those issues. And it's great that it's being brought up here as well.
Great. Thank you, Dmitry. I just, in the minutes that we have left, I just wondered if Sarah or Rachel had anything, questions that they wanted to ask. If so, please go ahead. Otherwise, we have one more question in the Q&A section.
Thank you, Emma. I did want to offer just one question. I was really struck by several of the panelists' discussion about how people in the United States and maybe other countries outside Russia are not really getting firsthand voices, right? Not really getting perspectives that are coming from on the ground, but are oftentimes coming through a filter. And so I just wondered, what would you recommend for people who are really interested in what's going on in Russia right now, really interested in human rights issues? Maybe they can read Russian, maybe they can't, but what would be some sources that you think would be direct from the voices on the ground, that would be powerful voices for us to listen to that we're not getting right now?
Thanks, Sarah.
I'm happy to take a stab, and then of course hand it over to colleagues on the ground. What there is not any of is shortage of information right now, and I think that's incredible. And I think that's what makes today's moment and today's protest quite different, right? Because everything is recorded in real time, and you could watch these arrests unfold on TikTok, on Instagram, etc. So social media, of course, provides a lot of information, and all the Russian outfits are on social media. You know, Russia has the highest rate of internet penetration in Europe, so it's very easy to find out what's going on there. But some of the places I would recommend, if you don't speak Russian and you don't read Russian, of course, Meduza is a very easy one to access. They have an English language mirror site to their Russian language site. Many Russian language outfits publish both in English and Russian. For example, Proact, whom I mentioned, They publish, they translate most of their investigations. The Insider also publishes, I believe, in English. That's the outfit that broke the Navalny poisoning investigation along with Bellingcat. So just to name a few, and there are many other independent outfits across the region in various countries. Znak, I think, is one outlet in Ekaterinburg that I think is worthy of following. And again, I think the local media is really where the story is. I find local, again, hyper-local media so fascinating right now because they're so skilled at making these connections between what's going on in their town, their city, and making the connections global. But of course, I would love to hear from the Russian colleagues what they would suggest.
Well, I fully agree, actually, and I believe that would be a fantastic project if would somebody just collect and with the volunteer help, maybe translate not everything, but something important from the local, from the social network, from the local community newspaper and the publications. We still have the internet independent somewhere in some places publication in the Russia, and that is the clear and direct delivery of the information, and that's without sometimes, well, with the certain, well, the context may be important to know, but without all these what we very much like to have, analysis, political comments. So let's put the audience judge themselves what is going on and how the people are, think what they are thinking about. But what is the interesting also might be to understand that ironically that is the maybe even students in scientific conference, that is the sometimes, well, I'm currently trying to find where the Russian politics survived. Russian politics survived in the unexpected places because, well, as you probably understand, public policy, well, almost dead in Russia. Well, Navalny, the only person who still remained a public politician in Russia, and in otherwise that is, we could find it in number of different places, and the very interesting to follow where exactly we still have the discussion or the dialogue in the scientific room, in the somewhere in the on the local newspapers, on the somewhere in the even the courtroom, because what Navalny personally said in the courtroom was immediately redistributed from the YouTube, and that is the most clear and direct voice of him, and that was the message, not for the, of course, for his followers, but for everyone.
Dmitry?
I have nothing to add to the media sources, but I would actually, I'm much bigger fan of direct engagement and dialogue. It would be great to have actually student groups talking about what issues concern people, for instance, or faculty groups or activist groups, whatever. I mean, I would be very much interested, what kind of issues do people who call themselves human rights activists or civil rights activists in the US care about at the moment, right? I mean, it would be an interesting discussion to have also with student groups. I mean, sometimes, I'm invited as a talking head, and it's a shift of perspective, and I say, I want to talk about Russia because you can read all of that in English sources. Let's talk about what you care about, and then we'll come back of how you can use those issues or use those competences to help also civil society in Russia, if you so wish, or maybe help to develop something in your own environment. That would be good as well. Because one of the things that I wanted to come back, didn't have a chance to, but Dmitry started the criticism of institutions. I'm actually a big fan of institutions. And the question that has been brought up, what could be done in the current situation? I think a lot of international reaction is limited to the kind of similar steps that have been taken before. Pass another resolution, talk about sanctions, reprimand once more the government for repression. But what kind of institutions are there in place to react? What can UN special rapporteurs actually do if they are underfunded and have no Russian-speaking staff, for instance? What can ECHR do if it's ignored in Russia and most of the countries don't care besides the political resolutions? I mean, I'm talking about the European Court of Human Rights. What can OEC do, for instance? Then once more is still living in the world of the 90s, then there is issues that you can have consensus about. You're not going to have consensus on issues like Navalny poisoning with Russia, right? They're going to deny it outright, and then many other things like that before. And Emma might well attest to the many war criminals that went unpunished without any sanctions because the institutions are weak. And that's a responsibility not only of kind of the governments, it's also a responsibility of the civil society, but of the governments, of course, as well, the Western governments that allow those institutions to weaken, not in least part of the US government that is actually quite hostile to many human rights institutions. When we talk about institutions, not rhetoric.
Yeah.
Rhetoric is all there, but the institutional capacity of those human rights actors to act is very little. And I believe that even silent institutions may once become institutions for change if civil society pushes them. And it actually goes for ombudsmen too. Nobody cared about them, or for public observation commissions, another quite amazing institution in the Russian context that has been devalued completely, but not only because the state pressured, you can expect it from the state, but because the civil society allowed it to, and was too weak to actually bring new blood into it. So, I mean, there are many things to discuss there, but I wanted to add, if there was one thing that I wanted to carry out of this, importance of direct dialogue and importance of investing in institutions that are able to react to human rights crises beyond just rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dmitry. And I think Dmitry's catching up with the chat too before me. The last question, and I think you succinctly answered it, and maybe Dmitry and Tatyana would like to say in a very short space of time. Elizabeth Smith has said, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I was wondering, what is the one point we should take away from this conversation in your opinion? And I think that will bring us to a close today. Tatyana, would you like to begin?
Sure. I think one takeaway I want you to have from this conversation is that there is not, Russians are not other. Issues that they're facing today are not somehow radically different than what it is that we're grappling with here. That things are much more global. That I think one of the tools of authoritarians, one of the goals is to really make us all feel like we're separate. We're all sitting, focus on what's going on in your backyard, really focus on your issues. Don't bother with what's going on somewhere else. It's not connected with you. And I think that's not the case, right? We are seeing authoritarianism become global, and we need to see solidarity become global. So people in Russia who are going to the streets, they're not heroes, they're not different than us. They're just everyday folk who want to live in a normal society where, again, they're not punished for regular things, where their voice is heard, where the vote is not stolen, where they're not arbitrarily arrested. And I think these dialogues that Dmitry's talking about, they're really key, because somehow we ended up back in this Cold War moment right now, 30 years later, where two societies feel like they're so different and they don't understand each other. And also, please listen to what folks are saying on the ground. Read local media there. It's very accessible in English now. Many people speak English. It's all just at your fingertips. So it's great that global media is covering these issues, but again, you can always just sort of with one step find what people on the ground are discussing, and I guarantee you'll find it so similar to the same questions that you're discussing with your classmates, with your colleagues.
Thanks, Tatyana. I feel as though we're just in part one of a part two forum. We didn't get to questions about, the exportation of authoritarian tactics abroad and so forth. And obviously many of the latter points that Dmitry brought up in terms of points of convergence that we could meet and discuss. Dmitry Dubrovsky, if you'd like to succinctly render your last point, we would appreciate hearing from you.
Well, my last point is more or less similar to what Tatyana has said already. So we are not so different like it looks like. Of course, we are living in different contexts, but in the terms of in the way we have the certain amount of the issues which are absolutely common. And in addition, we have unfortunate problem with the authoritarian regime, and it's rather, broadened out, that's overloaded our agenda in the way. but still we have a lot of common to discuss, and I believe we have common enemy to fight, which is the authoritarianism, which is precisely was global, and it's against this global global tendency. We should elaborate our global solidarity here, as I'm absolutely agree.
Well, that was just such a terrific discussion, and on behalf of Indiana University and the Russian East European Institute, RSW, I really sincerely thank you, and thank you for your sincerity and for your contribution to the discussion, and thanks to all our participants. I hope and I'm sure that they enjoyed it as much as we did. Sarah, did you have some concluding remarks?
Just very briefly, again, thank you to all our panelists. Let us continue this direct dialogue. This was amazing. If we can have a part 2 of this conversation, I think that would be wonderful. I did want to let the audience know that Rachel Myers, who introduced our panelists today, did a wonderful recorded interview with Tatyana Margolin. Thank you for that, Tatyana. And that will soon be available on the Russian Studies website, Russian Studies Workshop website at rsw.indiana.edu. So thank you again for a wonderful, very stimulating afternoon, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Be well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tatyana.
Thank you.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, bye.